Hello, I am Samantha Kern and I will graduate this coming May with my bachelor's degree in English. I chose to do a little research on disability rights in several countries, including America, China, Russia, Germany, and the United Kingdom. The reason I chose this topic is because I have a cousin who is both physically and mentally disabled, but the fascinating part is that he can work little jobs within certain companies that will actually pay him to do those little jobs. I wanted to know if there were other countries that did something similar or if they had less opportunities in other countries. Disability in America. We have the Americans with Disability Act, otherwise known as the ADA. It prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in employment, state and local government, public accommodations, commercial facilities, transportation, and telecommunications. It also applies to the United States Congress. To be protected by the ADA, one must have a disability or have a relationship or association with an individual with a disability. An individual with a disability is defined by the ADA as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, a person who has a history of or record of such an impairment, or a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment. The ADA does not specifically name all of the impairments that are covered, though. Public transportation, public accommodations, employment, telecommunication, relay services are also covered in the ADA. America has programs set up in certain companies in which those that are mentally handicapped but physically able to do things can do small jobs like counting pencils to be put in boxes, making up calendars, and even sorting the mail. The Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment actually helps those looking for jobs to find one that suits them best, kind of like what a staffing agency would do for someone who is capable of doing it themselves but need a little help. There is also the Fair Housing Act, Air Carrier Access Act, Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Rehabilitation Act, Architectural Barriers Act, and many more. In America, there are a lot of protections against the disabled, which is a great advancement compared to other countries that I've researched. Disability in China. People with disabilities in China prior to the year 1980 were referred to with discriminatory terms such as "canfei," which means the handicapped and useless. Because of this, there were very few laws that protected the rights of the disabled. A law that was put in place in 1990 was the Law of the People's Republic of China on the Protection of Disabled Persons. This law is formulated in accordance with the Constitution for purpose of protecting the lawful rights and interests of and developing undertakings for disabled persons and ensuring their equal and full participation in social life and their share of the material and cultural wealth of society. The citizens' rights and personal dignity of disabled persons shall be protected by this particular law. Discrimination against, insult of, and infringement upon disabled persons shall be prohibited, is basically what this law says. There are more than 50 national laws that contain specific provisions concerning people with disabilities, including the new law on employment promotion. China is also advocating and supporting international standards to protect and promote the rights of people with disabilities all over the world. Their education rights of disabled children. In China, there is a mixed system of integrated education and special education that has apparently increased the educational opportunities for people with disabilities. The China Disabled Persons Federation has reported that in the year 2000, the overall enrollment rate of students who were blind, deaf, or who experienced a form of intellectual disability was approximately 77%, a rate lower than the national enrollment average of children without disabilities. The year 2003 in China found nearly 323,000 children with disabilities lacking access to education due to factors such as poverty, although initiatives such as Project Hope and Spring Drizzle are attempting to assist those who have dropped out to include children with disabilities to return to school. Disability rights in Russia. To officially be considered a disabled person, a Russian citizen must have a social and medical expert evaluation set by the Ministry of Health. Now, this is only for Russian-born citizens, so for those that move to the country, other obligations are required before they can have the disability rights. After the test, citizens are eligible for legal and medical benefits, including financial support and pensions. Russians don't exactly have the best lives if they are disabled. It was only recently, 2015 or so, that they made it mandatory for all buildings to have ramps for those that have wheelchairs. Even now, those ramps and lifts aren't the easiest to get around on. When it comes to education, the rights of a disabled person are much lower than in other countries. Unlike in America, there are very few inclusion schools, which means those students that need special classes are not in the same schools as those that do not. Although the country is working on making schools inclusive, it's a long process. While Russian para-athletes were banned from the 2016 Rio Paralympics, that didn't stop Russia from hosting its own events on September 8, 2016. There were a lot of contestants that came out, and there were supporters in the stands waving them all on. There was plenty of media there, and it got the attention of those around the country. So Russia is working on the laws and allowances of the disabled people, and they're encouraging them to partake in actual events. And while they have come a long way, they still have a little bit further to go. Disability rights in Germany. The disability rights movement started in 1980 when a vacationer to Germany complained to the courts about having to look at all the disabled people on her vacation. The court ruled that her expenses be dropped, and then that's when the group managed to make its first stance. 5,000 protesters stood outside the courts to make a statement, and while the court didn't change their mind, it brought to light the issues of the disabled peoples in the country. The next time these people got together was in the United Nations National Year of the Disabled in 1981. Those that could go went and chained themselves up to the stage so the president could not give a speech. While the people didn't really know what they wanted, they got the media's attention and they continued to fight for their rights for the following years. Their third and final stance was Cripples Tribunal, also called Krüppel Tribunal. It was held in analogy to Amnesty International's Russell tribunals, which drew attention to human rights violations, in this case, the violation of disabled people's human rights. But organizers wanted to charge the government with their segregated disability politics and call for massive and radical resistance. Charges were brought against the following: the living conditions in institutions, arbitrary use of power by authorities, lack of mobility, sheltered workshops, and discrimination of disabled women, psychiatry, and the pharmaceutical industry. Home help and counseling were the next to come about from the disability rights movement. 1990 saw the founding of the Initiative for the Legal Equalization of Disabled People, which subsequently started lobbying. Anti-discrimination was to be achieved by amending the German Constitution, which had become necessary due to the unification anyway, and through equalization laws on the federal and the states level. In 1992, the Forum of Disabled Lawyers was founded, whose members came mostly from the disability movement. In coalition with the traditional disability organizations, they managed to convince politicians that protection from discrimination against disabled people had to be included into the amended Constitution. This was achieved in 1994 with the insertion of the sentence, "No person shall be disfavored because of disability." This 25-year-long fight has not yet achieved countrywide accessible transportation, but most regions have come close. An accessible environment is also still an issue, but one that is at least nowadays covered by several laws on legal equalization and anti-discrimination. Now, on January 1st, 2017, the first phase of reforms of the controversial Federal Participation Act entered into force in Germany. The other parts will enter into force on January 1st of 2018, 2020, and 2023. The Federal Participation Act amends several laws with the goal of strengthening the participation in society of people with disabilities and their self-determination. It will provide amendments to the laws applicable to severely disabled persons, increase the income and cash allowance that disabled people can have before they lose the right to receive federal benefits, and improve workplace integration management mechanisms in order to better identify the type of assistance or support needed to overcome a worker's inability or difficulties in work. So they are working and will continue to work on the disability rights of their people. Disability in the United Kingdom. There was the Disability Rights Commission Act in 1999. This act basically covers everything that has to do with protecting the disabled person. There is to be no discrimination against them for any reason whatsoever, and if there was an instance, like they weren't hired because they were in a wheelchair, this law protects them and they would be able to sue the company if they so wished. The Equality Act of 2010 also helped protect the rights of the disabled people. The Equality Act of 2010 covers everything from job employment to application forms to aptitude and proficiency tests. It also covers education rights, working rights, access to goods, services, and facilities, and buying and renting land or property. Just like in America, the United Kingdom has programs for the handicapped citizens to work regular jobs. So even if they do not have the mental capacity of someone their own age, they are still able to do small jobs in many companies that will pay them just like any other citizen. Now this is my works cited. I learned that there are still many problems with multiple countries when it comes to disability rights. Not all countries have protection for the impaired, and not all countries even protect all of their citizens. Up until the 1980s, most of these countries didn't care about their disabled people. In fact, countries like Russia and China didn't even have ramps for those in wheelchairs, and those that were lucky enough to get into school were set in separate classrooms than their peers. Most disabled people were put into institutions and kept away from society in a lot of different countries, including Germany, Russia, and China, and this was in the 1980s. Like, this wasn't that long ago. While most countries are trying to change the rights of disabled peoples, it will likely be a long time before every citizen is welcomed anywhere.